Hey everybody, Ragnarok here, continuing to go over my games from the Philadelphia Open, the under 1600 section, where I placed 10th out of 70 plus people, which was pretty nice. This was the game, the 5th round, where it was the end of the first day, so this was actually my first really long time, because the other ones I had been doing 30 minutes each player. This one you get 2 hours each side, and then if you reach 40 moves you get another half hour with a 10-second delay. So I was playing as white, and this is the guy who actually ended up winning the whole thing. It's a shame, could have been me, but this is how we learn from our mistakes. I played some bit of a weird opening, but I think overall it turned out pretty well. And there's really one key move that happened in the endgame, which I want you guys to see because I know I'm never going to forget it. Sometimes it takes a big loss for you to realize that, well, you made a mistake and it won't happen again, hopefully, So I played e4, c5, the Sicilian, knight f3. And this is where it was different. Normally, people play d6 against me. The reason he's playing e6, is because once I go d4, c takes d4, knight takes, then usually knight f6, knight c3. A lot of times players will come here. And I kind of didn't like the idea of this, so I did what I could to avoid it, because there have been games where I've been absolutely crushed doing it the wrong way, in the wrong order, and things can happen here because this pawn's kind of hanging. Let's just say I try to block this pin. Well, actually that would actually work pretty well. If I take here, he takes, I would be up a piece in this exchange. But I think the reason it kind of confuses me because most of the time I want to bring my bishop to e3, and I think it's a little passive bringing my bishop here, because yes, of course he doesn't have to take in that scenario if we go back. He doesn't have to take this pawn, but this seems a little bit more passive for me, and maybe it's okay, but I prefer my bishop to be a more active role over here. So anyway, he plays bishop to c6. I try to simplify things if I can. Trade here, knowing that he's going to have a nice attack on this pawn. Gives me a nice little bit of a tempo. I push e5, and then his bishop or knight moves into d5. And I decided I wanted to trade off all the knights here, but I think after looking at the game, better would be to go to e4, because this knight is now doing better than this knight, because this knight can't easily be kicked. Let's just say he pushed here. Well, now I can take back here. If the knight takes, I've got check, bishop takes, otherwise the king has to move. And now his king kind of can't really easily castle. He could do something like this. Queen takes, blocks. This just seems like a better position for me. I would have the bishop pair, and I think pawns are even, but I've got a better pawn structure than he does. So ideally, this would be a good situation for me. So that's why in that situation, instead of taking, I think this is fine because I can kick his knight away. Let's just say he develops. c5 works fine. Maybe even coming in here with this move here, because if the knight moves, now I've got check. He has to take, and now I've got a nice advanced pawn. I could even maybe take with this pawn, although better is probably the e pawn taking. And I could also push these pawns, and I just have a nice pawn island, and he has less space, which is nice. So I think that would have been pretty good for me. Afterwards, of course, looking at the game, but I decided to take his knight on d5. He takes back. Either way he takes, he has to have these doubled up pawns, whether it's the e pawn or the c pawn. I think he made the right decision with that move there. I bring my bishop out just because once he castles, my bishop will have a nice sight on here. But he does a little bit of a weird move. Here's the idea. If I take his bishop, he just does check. Maybe I develop my bishop and he goes here, and now I can't castle. So maybe I'd come here. I mean, not that I have to castle in this situation. It's kind of the same thing. But, nonetheless, that was the idea there. I decided to castle instead. He takes my bishop. Queen takes back. I wanted to take with queen and not pawn because I want to be able to push c4 eventually. I think that's going to be a nice structure for me. Queen goes to c7. I just defend my pawn because the queen was attacking the e5 pawn. And I don't really want to push f4 in this situation because if you go back, if I push f4, I think he just undoubles his pawns. No matter what else I really do, pawn's undoubled. Now I'm kind of in a weirder position where I've got this isolated pawn now, and I don't really think that's really good for me. Of course, in this situation he would take it back there, but I decided to just defend the pawn. Maybe f4 at some point, maybe bishop f4, but he plays g6. I thought that was a little weird, a little bit passive for him. But then again, I probably should have played bishop to f4 in this situation, because his main goal is to just go here, have a double attack on this pawn. Then I think there I would probably just play what I do anyway later in the game, so we'll get to that point. But instead I played bishop e3. My goal was, once he goes here, my bishop seems to be in a better role than it is on the king side. That was my idea anyway. Plus, you know, if he tries to push here, I've got this idea. Queen has to move, I could win a piece. Not that he was going to do that, but that's kind of limiting his moves in some way. This pawn can't easily be challenged right away. So he castles. I bring my rook over to c1. I thought maybe he would do this at some point, kind of forcing me to move, but at the same time, that just kind of gives me an extra tempo, so it didn't seem like a good move for him. So the main point here, he does f6. My main goal is to push c4, as I highlighted a little bit earlier. Yes, it undoubles his pawns when he takes back, but now I've got a nice weakness on this e7 pawn, or sorry, d7 pawn. It can't really move easily. Plus, when he takes back, I took back with rook. If we go back real quick, I think if he had taken here, I would have, the idea here anyway, was to take the d pawn back. Queen has to move somewhere, and then I think I just either, probably with the bishop, yeah, just win the pawn back. If he can't take, he might take here first, but this pawn structure is just awful, these two pawns. Eventually, maybe a rook, I'm going to win this pawn back. So that wouldn't have been good for him, I think. Instead, he decides to take the pawn. I take back with rook. He goes over here, double attack actually. This was a good move, attacking my rook and my pawn, because my rook moved off the c1 file, or c1 square. It's no longer protecting the other rook. So the best move here, in my opinion, I think this is a really good move, was b4. Because if he takes this pawn, which he was threatening, see if you see the puzzle there, I'll just move along. The move is rook to a1. And now his queen can't move anywhere along this file, can't move anywhere here because of the queen. All of these, bishops covering b1, queen's covering all three of these, and king's covering f2. And then, of course, rook is covering b1. So the queen would be trapped in that situation. So he can't take the pawn. Instead, he moves away. I think best here now, maybe I connect the rooks. Maybe I just take this pawn. Taking a pawn might not be bad. I could even trade. The problem here is my rook's hanging now, so I can't take that piece. Probably would want to move here. Maybe even up here. Attacking the rook and potentially the pawn eventually. But instead, I move to queen to c3. Just trying to put more pressure on, excuse me, on the a1 h8 diagonal. But you know, he opens everything up. We exchange pawns, exchange bishops. I've got a tempo. My rooks are off the back file, so I do have to be careful. But I've got a tempo on his queen. And then I go back because he was threatening to take here with an eventual checkmate. Let's just say I did something like this. He could take here and then checkmate. So I move, he goes rook to f7, doubling up his rooks, or that's the idea anyway. And I play rook to c2. Not really a great move in retrospective. You know, better probably would be maybe just a4. Start putting pressure on his queen here. If he doubles up, I could maybe just move my queen back. It seems a little bit better. Maybe even in this situation, just move this rook up. Because if he pushes, no, that's actually bad. Yeah, I think probably just come back here. It's just fine. So instead, I do this rook c2 move, which is kind of weird. I thought maybe like this is the only open file, so I'll just take advantage of this. But the problem is now he's got this semi-open file and a lot of pressure on f2. So he goes there. Again, I have to be passive, bring my queen back because I need to have three defenders, the king, queen, and rook, because of his three attackers on this pawn here. So he moves his rook up, just kind of, I guess it's a waiting move. I don't really see any huge advantage of this move. I play a5 because he moves his rook anyway. Maybe he just wasn't sure what to do. But yeah, so I push here to try to give my king some space with g2. He trades, which makes sense. Now he pushes this pawn, and things are getting a little bit scary because this pawn now is able to be pushed. Now it's a pass pawn on its own, and it's defended by this pawn too, which makes it tough for me to get rid of. I could have just moved my rook up, but instead I challenged the queen because, of course, if he takes the rook, I take the queen. So he has to move his queen first. So he moves, and then I bring my rook up. Maybe a better square could have been back here, maybe. Idea being to bring my rook over here and have pressure on this pawn. This pawn can't really move forward easily anyway. It just kind of like changes the focus maybe here. This kind of pawn is like separate at this point. I think that would be a little better for me. But instead I go to c5, which is okay. d5, so he starts pushing. King f1 was a bit of a mistake here. I think my goal was to just get my king in front of the pawn, but it's a little dangerous with the queen and the rook still on the board, so there's really nothing I could have done with that king there. Even better here, probably maybe f4 right away, kind of preventing him from pushing this pawn. If he pushes this pawn, that's okay. No, I mean, I would just take it. So yeah, I think f4 here probably would have been a little bit better. This diagonal is open, yes, but his queen can't easily penetrate it. He'd have to go here, here, and then what's he going to do? He doesn't have a bishop to help him out. So I think that would have been fine for me, but for whatever reason, decided to do king f1. Just weird mistake. So he brings his rook in, and I bring my queen over to c1. And the problem here is I actually calculated this out. I calculated that I would win an endgame if he decided to trade his queen and rook for my queen and rook, which he does. So his rook takes, I take with queen, queen takes, pawn takes. Now the first move, this is a, you know, again, this mistake you just got to learn from, but this is a win for white at this point. The problem is you have to do things in the right order, and black has to start in the right order as well. So let's just say black does the logical move of protecting this pawn, getting ready to move forward. Well, now we have to consider what's known as the box. The box would be how many squares away this pawn is. So it's on the fourth square away. So 1, 2, 3 tempo away from queening. And if we go like this, just kind of make like a little bit of a box. That looks like a good box. The king is not in the box. And if the king's not in the box, that means I have enough tempo. And if we play it out, we'll see. 1, 2, 3. And I would queen. I don't know what the black pieces came up there. So that's why you have to be in the box first. So in this situation, doing anything except king to f7 is a mistake. Because now if we look at it, the king is in the box. Which means that if I start moving, 2, 3, yes, I get the queen, but he's in time to capture it. So that's a little trick you want to keep in mind. So here's the mistake I made. King e2. Completely lost the game because of this move. I really have no advantage. See if you can see the correct move, but it's really all about controlling squares. So the main weakness here is that this pawn is 2 squares away from this piece here. So the best move is f4. So simple. If he tries to move in here, he has this pass pawn he has to worry about. So maybe he comes in this way, I come in here, he can't easily get to it. And then I protect the pawn. This pawn is too far away from the other pawn and the king. Because he has to deal with this thread, he can't really do anything about it. If he decides to push here, I think I'm okay with even just taking at this point. Because now I'm up a pawn, it's 5 pawns to 4. Now he could connect these pawns, but I think even just h4 would be fine at this point. Because these pawns can overcome the pawn on the h file. So let's just play out a couple of moves here. I think I can just start playing around here. If he takes over here, his king had to take care of this pass pawn, but he can't really worry about this pawn. And again, if you think about the box, 2 squares away from queening, it would look something like this. King's way too far away from that too. So that would have been better, and if he takes, same issue. There we go. King's too far away. So that would have been a much better move and would have won the game and possibly maybe even first place. I had 3.5 points at this point. Round 5 I would have had 4.5 with 2 rounds to go. Oh well. So yeah, there's really nothing he could do if he pushes this pawn. Now he's got to worry about 2 pass pawns. I don't think he can take either of these. Yeah, he can't take this because he goes back. And if he goes, I mean, these both squares are blocked off, so if he goes back, kind of gives my king some tempo. Just in case that didn't make sense, I'll go again over that. So if I go here, if he pushes the pawn here, I can just take. This pawn's really eventually going to fall. There's a couple options. I think best is probably just to push this pawn. Because again, if he takes this pawn, push forward, queens, and I win. Or, I mean, what else is he going to do? Maybe move here? Again, his king can't move anywhere. It's being blocked off from this pawn. And if he ever takes this pawn, same thing, I just move forward. So he has to do something else. I can just start gobbling up the other pawns. King still can't take this pawn. Does something else. Doesn't matter. Does something else. Take. Now the pawn's protected, and it's still blocked off. And this is just a win. I can even play it out. Yeah, not really much you can do. There's a lot of ways it could have been a win there, and really the main key move, if we go back, was playing f4 instead. I wish I had realized right away what I just went over, that these pawns are just too far apart from each other, and blocking them from connecting is really the key here. My main goal was that pass pawn. I knew it was going to be a nice couple squares away and just a constant threat in the back of his mind, knowing I would be able to eventually take this pawn. But just for the fun of it, let's just go over what happens and the reason why king e2 is a mistake. First off, he pushes and connects the pawns. So let's see if f4 would have worked here. It might have, actually, but I don't know. Let's see. I didn't play f4, by the way, but if he pushes, what do I do? Probably just start playing on this side. King comes in, maybe a4. He could push, but then I block, and this pawn can't go forward. It might be a win. Might be a little too late. I think maybe just push this pawn. Because if he takes, he is in the box. And again, the box is because I'm 4 squares away, or 3 squares away. The king is close enough. I might just do this. Yeah, this is a win now too. Because now the box is too far away for the king. So his best bet would probably be to go here. Go here so he can get his pawn to move. And now here's another key. I did bring this up, mistakes that you always remember in tournaments. I know now from a tournament I played in high school, never keep your king on the queening square. Because in this particular scenario, I would be able to queen with check. And no matter where he goes, check. Eventually I would bring my queen up. If he ever goes in front of the pawn, I can just do anything else because he can't move this pawn. So he would have to stay in front of it. Or not in front of it, sorry. And then, boom. So yeah, like a lot of things to learn from this. I will go back to the game. It looks like this was even a mistake. Because yeah, there's nothing I can really do. I did f4 just way too late. Now he's got a nice square. He's got this pawn. If I push it and he takes, it could potentially be a draw, but I think this might be a win for black. We'll play out a couple of moves. I think he just queens first in this situation. Yep, once he gets the queen first, push. Even this works, just getting your queen in front. And I'll cover a lot of this stuff of endgame stuff, but I really just wanted to go over the game specifically first here. More articles will be on my site and other videos, so let me know if there's other specific endgames you want to see, but this was just crushing for me, so it's a fun mistake to learn from. Definitely very disappointed, but I'm glad it happened because it won't happen again. I'm going to know a lot more going into the next tournament. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be going over my next loss in my next video. A little bit unfortunate scenario there, but I did play into a tough game, and I hope you'll enjoy it. So thanks so much, guys. See you next week.